And finally, to the real reason for being here this morning, and that's to hear our speaker, Mr. Peter Reddish. He has worked in the animal feed and flour milling industry in the UK before going overseas in 1984 to work on a rural development project in Nigeria. From then, he's worked in 14 different developing countries, including spending over 9 years on the Old Silk Road in Tashkent, Uzbekistan. His last long-term assignment was as advisor to the Minister of Development and Planning in the Solomon Islands. Wherever he goes, he has a camera and a fishing rod with him. So let's give a warm welcome to Mr. Peter Reddish.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen.
Good morning.
And what a fantastic turnout in such a lovely theatre. I hope you're ready to play some games on the Great Silk Road. The old Silk Road. Where is it? What was it? Here we have UK, and there is the area we're going to look at, Central Asia, part of the Great Silk Road. And the old Silk Road routes, running across from China to Europe, goods going backwards and forwards, not only by land but by sea. Camel trains coming all the way over land, but they went from city to city, leaving the goods in one city, the merchants there, packaging them, rebundling them, moving them on different caravan trains, moving them slowly across towards Europe. And here's a modern photograph, just so we know exactly where we are. Uzbekistan, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Turkmenistan and Tajikistan and Afghanistan. Those of you who watch Pointless in the afternoons will know those names very well indeed, even if you can't spell them. And there was a two-way trade. From China, there were bolts of silk, lacquerware, porcelain. But going to China, and many people think it was a one-way traffic, it wasn't. Dates, saffron powder and pistachio nuts from Persia. Frankincense, aloes and myrrh from North Africa, sandalwood from India, and the one that really surprised me, glass bottles from Egypt. And it all went by caravan, camels going across the deserts of Central Asia. And even today you can find these camels dotted around, far fewer than there were. Most of them are now in the most of the goods that are transported around that area are in enormous articulated vehicles, not four-legged ones. And there were a lot of travellers down the old Silk Road. Alexander the Great went down that way on his campaign to India. Genghis Khan, with all his ravaging horde, came over 1,000 years later, plundering, raping and pillaging. Marco Polo came on that route, and very interestingly, he was preceded by his father. Not many people know that. I didn't until I started to look at Marco Polo's travels, but Marco Polo got the fame because he was the one who wrote the book. And let's come slightly more up to date. The great game players in the 19th century. If you've got a great game, you've got to have a pitch. And there's the pitch. And then we need the players. And in this particular great game, we have Imperial Russia and we have Great Britain. Imperial Russia moving down south, extending its empire. Great Britain trying to extend its own empire, going north from India, over the Himalayas. And the first players of note, Charles Stoddart, in 1838. He came down to talk to the Emir of Bukhara, one of the major emirates on the Silk Road, way out in the desert in Uzbekistan. Glorious buildings, blue-tiled domes, madrasas, and the entrance to the Emir's palace. It was into that palace that Stoddart went, had his audience with the Emir, but unfortunately Stoddart was a bit of a failure as a diplomat. He didn't get on with the Emir. The Emir decided he was more interested in staying with the Russians than joining the British. So he decided that he would throw Stoddart into jail. Well, not exactly jail. He threw him into a hole, some 20 feet deep and 15 feet in diameter, just looking like the shaft of an old well. And there he stayed, in captivity, down the hole, occasionally fed and watered. And you can see that hole in here even today. Behind one of these walls, inside one of these curved areas, there is that great hole, and it's horrendous. He never saw the glorious sights of the storms in Bukhara. Instead, Captain Arthur Connolly came across a few years later to try and persuade the Emir to let his colleague out of this huge hole in the ground. Sadly, he too failed at diplomacy, and he ended up in the same hole. So at least they had each other for company. But not for too long, because the Emir got sick and tired of them. One day had them dragged out, charged them with spying, and executed them in the open space outside his palace. Not a very friendly welcome to the old Silk Road. And coming more up to date, the Russians invaded Afghanistan through Uzbekistan and then retreated in 1989. They retreated with a bloody nose. In fact, everybody who's gone into Afghanistan in that fashion has retreated with a bloody nose. History repeats itself. And then some chap called Peter Reddish arrived in Uzbekistan in 1995 on a 10-month assignment. Well, that was the theory. I ended up staying there for 9 years and 3 days. And in 1996, there was another visitor, Prince Charles. And I met Prince Charles at a reception in the British Embassy. And he said to me, "Julie Brand here?" So I said, "Yes, sir. I've got an apartment on the far corner of this big block." "Oh. Good job they planted all those trees. Hides the most god-awful architecture." Standing beside me at the time was Elior Ganier, the Uzbek foreign minister, who speaks perfect English. He never batted an eyelid, but a few months later he made a side reference to his understanding of Prince Charles's attitude. As you can see there, it's typical Soviet concrete blocks with the trees. Tashkent was hit by an earthquake in the mid-1960s. Quite a severe earthquake, and the entire centre of the city was destroyed. Fortunately, very few people were killed, and typically, as Uzbekistan was part of the Soviet Union at that time, they got on the phone to Moscow and said, "We're in trouble, the whole place has fallen down, we need some new buildings. So we want 110 of those apartment blocks, design 57, we'll have 73 of the 14s, some of those skyscrapers, let's have another dozen of those, etc." So the Russians moved in a big way and rebuilt the entire centre of the city, hence the broad streets that you can see in this photograph. And that's the bit round the back which is typical Soviet architecture. If you live in a tall block of flats like this, you have a lift up to the upper floors. Not that it works very often. It's often used by the drunks and others for various other purposes, and not the most salubrious of places to visit. The whole time I was in Tashkent, I had 3 different apartments, upgrading each time, but I always went for the top floor of a 4-story building. They didn't put lifts in 4 stories. So what's there? What's the interest in that part of the world? Well, everybody knows about Afghanistan and the drugs. The drug lords in northern Afghanistan, sending their drugs northwards up through Russia and then having them dispersed across Europe, coming over the border late at night in official vehicles. But the main thing and the interest from all the Western and Eastern countries, Asian countries, is that there is gold, uranium, oil and gas, primarily untapped apart from domestic use. The gold, yes, of course, that is shipped out onto the world markets. The uranium used by the Russians, the oil and gas, still in its infancy. Vast quantities of crude oil and 40% of the world's global gas reserves sitting there, sitting on a small fortune. And the Russians, in the old days, and I don't know whether that shows up on there, no, but if you can imagine Russia, you see Russia way up in the north with its border with Kazakhstan. Kazakhstan had oil on that northern border, has oil, so the Russians built the pipelines down as far as northern Kazakhstan. They decided not to extend their pipelines down into this part of Central Asia. They just keep those in reserve, keep it in the bank, just in case for later. And so there was suddenly a great big scrap going on as to who was going to get this oil and gas. But before we get into that, we need to look at who's running those countries. Well, there are a bunch of dinosaurs. President Nazarbayev of Kazakhstan. It was one of his cronies who bought Prince Andrew's house in Windsor when the divorce proceedings were taking place. It was on the market for £12 million. He paid 15 million for it. They are not short of money. Turkmenistan, they had a president called Turkmenbashi. He named himself after the country. Like Chairman Mao, he wrote a red book. The red book was the only book that was used in schools. There were no other books at all. He renamed all the days of the week and the months of the year. One of the months of the year is melon. There is Mother's Day. There is Farmer's Day. But the ultimate is in the centre of Ashgabat, or was, a tall plinth reminiscent of Nelson's column in Piccadilly, with a gold statue, more than life-sized, solid gold, of Turkmenbashi with his finger out. And his statue, solid gold, turned to follow the sun. Sorry, I got that wrong. He turned and the sun followed his finger. He always insisted on driving himself to work, so the police closed the entire centre of the city, from his palace down to his presidential office, for at least an hour before he was due to come, and sometimes he was delayed at home, so he was late. So the entire place, twice a day, was in absolute chaos. He died and was replaced by another despot, but at least he took down the gold statue, but we don't know what happened to the gold. And a very large dinosaur, of whom you might have heard in the past couple of weeks, Islam Karimov. Born in 1938, he was appointed by Moscow to run Uzbekistan when it was under Soviet control. When the Berlin Wall came down, he was sitting there, so he said, okay, I am on seat, as they say in Africa. I'm going to continue to remain on seat, and he ran the country. He became president in 1989. The 1st of September is the anniversary date of Uzbekistan's independence. And the 1st of September this year was the 25th anniversary, but he was not there. He died 4 days before the anniversary celebrations. He just didn't appear at the anniversary celebrations for obvious reasons, but they said nothing. They simply declared the following day a public holiday to make sure that everybody would be at home, not on the streets. And then they began to break the news slowly. His successor, or interim successor, is the Prime Minister, Mirziyoyev, who is from the same clan as Karimov. Karimov was from the Samarkand clan. And when Stalin drew the lines on the map to divide up the whole of Central Asia, to say this is Uzbekistan, this is Turkmenistan, etc., he just used a ruler and a pencil and drew straight lines. No regard for the ethnicity of each individual country. So Samarkand is ethnically Tajik, but it's in Uzbekistan. And they, of course, as a clan or a mafia, fight with the Uzbeks in Tashkent. And who was likely to succeed him? Well, here's his elder daughter, Gulnara. Very interesting what WikiLeaks put on the internet when it got its hands on the dispatches from the American embassy. She was the most hated person in the country. She is currently richer, it is estimated, than Paris Hilton. And she was responsible for allocating mobile phone rights across Uzbekistan. She took enormous bribes from the Russians and the Scandinavian companies. It's estimated $1 billion is her wealth. But she ran into problems. She fell out with Daddy about 2 years before he died. He put her under house arrest. So there's no chance of her succeeding when they have the presidential elections in a couple of months' time. She won't take over. She was toted around at one stage as being the successor, but no chance now. In fact, she's totally disappeared. There are rumours around that she's fled to Israel, but who knows where she is, but she's definitely out of the market. Corruption is rife in that part of the world. So in 2014, she was put under house arrest, and where she is today, heaven only knows. But Mummy and younger daughter were present when the president's coffin left Tashkent to go to be buried in Samarkand. Elder daughter has not been seen. So we have a great game, and in the past we had players, and who's playing it now, or was when I was there? Well, the Russians, of course. They have colonial aspirations, and the Russians have always wanted a cordon sanitaire around their border. If there's going to be some bother, let's have it on next door's territory rather in our backyard. So they're very keen to maintain their influence in this part of the world, the same way that they were very keen to maintain their influence in Ukraine when Ukraine was making noises about joining the EU. both China and Russia need gas and oil. And there's already a pipeline now being built going across the Tian Shan Mountains, the back end of the Himalayas, over to China. And then we have the Americans in there. They, of course, got involved in Afghanistan and ended up with an air base in Uzbekistan. And not only that, they were using Uzbekistan as part of their rendition program. All those people locked up in Guantanamo Bay without trial and unable to get information from them, well, ship them over to Uzbekistan. The lads over there know how to get the information. In 2002, I was asked by the European Commission if I would open an office for them, the forerunner of a delegation, the EU's version of an embassy. I was thinking of leaving Uzbekistan, having been there 6 years, but I thought, okay, I will do this. So for the last 3 years of my tenure there, I opened and ran an office for the European Union. I was the only expatriate there. I had 7 Uzbek staff. Obviously, wanting something of that size, you don't need vast office spaces. You don't want anything too ostentatious, so I thought we would rent a house and just use that as an office. But the Uzbeks decided otherwise. They offered me space up on the 13th floor in this building. I couldn't afford the rent. There was no chance. I said no. In the end, I got it for 10% of what they were asking. The World Bank moved into those offices, and I don't know what they paid, but I'm sure we had a better deal than they had. My supreme boss at that stage was Chris Patton, whom we all know from Hong Kong days. He came out just to open these offices, do a bit of flag waving, as the EU had actually started to have a permanent place in Uzbekistan. These are some of the gentlemen who were standing around watching a video of various activities that the EU had funded in Uzbekistan. And I just highlight this particular gentleman standing there. I'm not talking about the length of his jacket or the cut of his trousers or anything like that. But behind him, you can see a grey box up against the window on the floor. Well, I had been in Uzbekistan for a fair number of years, and I knew that I was being watched. Sometimes I'd go on trips around the country, driving, and you could always tell if you were being tailed. They weren't very subtle about it. But it didn't worry me at all. I've got nothing to hide. When we moved into these offices, I just had a feeling that something was going on. I knew my staff. I knew that they would have the SNB, the equivalent of the KGB, coming round to see them in the evenings occasionally to ask them what was going on, and they'd tell them. But there were certain things that I kept to myself, or I thought I had. I mentioned it to a good friend who was managing director of Nestle in Uzbekistan. They had opened a factory serving the whole of Central Asia. And he said, well, we've had information that's been disappearing as well. He said, I've got something you can borrow. You can pick it up on Saturday, but I want it back by Sunday night. You're not allowed to have it in this country, and if you get caught with it, you don't tell them where it came from. Fair enough. So I picked up the scanner, immediately headed to my own apartment and scanned it. Not a sound. Sunday morning I went into the office when it was all quiet. Went round the office, and it was a large open plan office with just a meeting room on one side and then another room which I had as an office and a much smaller meeting room. I swept the entire office and the meeting room, not a sound. Went into my office, and under the window were 2 of these grey boxes, which were the central heating and air conditioning units combined. All of a sudden I got a bing and another bing, both units. And it dawned on me. Every week the maintenance man came up to clean the filters on the heater and the air conditioning units. They were bugged. I never said a word about it, never mentioned it at all. Because had I mentioned it, they would have immediately moved them elsewhere and I would have had the problem of finding them. I say I never mentioned it. Here are 5 members of my staff. When I was leaving, about a week before I was leaving, I had to speak at a conference and exhibition in Bukhara. I announced at the weekly staff meeting where I was going to go the following week, and 2 of the staff said, "We've never been there." I said, "You're joking. We've never been there." I said, "Right, you're coming. Who else is coming with me?" These 5 came. This is one afternoon. We've been sitting there drinking green tea. We were just relaxing after the conference. And I don't know whether it's showing up. Yes, there. This lady here is Zulfia, a professor of English, a lovely lady, speaks superb English, but she once told me that she had been on a trip to West Africa, an official government trip. The alarm bells immediately ring. She's one of the nomenclatura. Okay. The lady right over on the far right-hand, on your right-hand side, is Gulnara, her daughter, who was my office manager. And we were laughing and joking and generally unwinding as I was about to leave Uzbekistan. And they said to me, "Peter, why do you always joke about Boris in your office?" I said, "You mean I sit there and I say, 'Did you hear that, Boris?'" I said, "I have known ever since we moved in that my office is bugged." "No, it's not." I said, "Of course it is. The KGB's had me bugged since day one." Gulnara turned over to her mother Zulfia and said in basic Russian that even I could understand, "Mummy, he's talking about our family business." They confessed as I had confessed. There was another problem. I'm a keen photographer. I'm also keen on human rights. I received some photos that I was asked to send on to Brussels by any means possible. I got them in hard copy and electronically. They were photos of 2 corpses that had been delivered to people in Samarkand in sealed coffins. These 2 gentlemen had been incarcerated way out in the desert, and they had died out there. They were brought back to their families, and their families were told, "Don't open the coffins, just bury them." Well, they opened the coffins and took photographs. These two men have been scalded to death. I'm not prepared to show you the photos, they're horrific. They have been dipped in boiling water up to the waist. So much for human rights. I sent those photos over to Brussels. Thereafter, my email was always read. Any attachment to an email meant that it was delayed by 24 hours. An ordinary straight text by email, that came through in an hour or so, but they were obviously reading everything. I mentioned earlier the British Embassy in Tashkent, and whilst I was there, the last ambassador there in my tenure was a chap called Craig Murray, of whom you might have heard. He had a very interesting sense of humour. he said one day, "Early mornings, like the Loch Ness Monster, are something in which I believe, but I have never seen." And then he went on to say other things. And those were his milder ones. There was a human rights conference in Tashkent in 2002. It was open to the world. The BBC were there. I think CNN were there. All the embassies and their ambassadors were there, and there would be the French, German, Italian, US, Hungarian, Polish, Russian, and the surrounding stands. Craig Murray was due to speak at that conference, and he came in late. In fact, they had to rearrange the order of service, as it were, because Craig hadn't shown up, but he phoned to say, "I am on my way." His deputy said to me, "Peter, we're late because Craig has had to wait for clearance of his speech by the Foreign Office." Well, Craig went to town. Uzbekistan is not a functioning democracy. The boiling to death of 2 members of Hizb ut-Tahrir was not an isolated incident. The US ambassador left immediately after Craig's speech and was on the line to George Bush. George Bush had been extolling Uzbekistan as their new strategic partner. You can imagine the kerfuffle that there was when this was being reported on the BBC, lots of newspapers, and around the world generally. George Bush must have had a hissy fit because he was straight on the phone to Tony Blair. Tony Blair was straight on the phone to the Foreign Office demanding that Craig Murray be sacked. But they couldn't sack him because they had approved it. There was a real kerfuffle. More WikiLeaks. The Americans, in a rather two-faced fashion, supporting the Uzbeks in spite of all this nastiness, called it a nightmarish world of rampant corruption, organised crime and forced labour and torture. So they were telling them back in Washington what was going on, but there was a totally different attitude for the general public. As I said, Craig's speech had had prior approval by the Foreign Office. The CIA were using Uzbekistan for part of their rendition program. In fact, on the runway at Tashkent Airport on a couple of occasions, I saw Learjets registered with an N at the beginning of their registration. That meant they were American civil aircraft. The Americans didn't have any economic activity in Uzbekistan whatsoever. So probably that was the CIA bringing in passengers for the Uzbeks to work on. And of course, there was an agreement since World War II that any information that had been received by the Americans would be passed on to MI6. So Craig had certainly blown the whistle on all this lot. At the same time, he was having problems with his family life. His wife took the children back to UK, and after about 6 months, he took up with a local lass, Nadira Aliyeva. Yes, she was a dancer in a nightclub. But having said that, she was a very nice, or is a very nice girl. She was on the side of human rights. She was dragged in by the police, allegedly raped by them. Her father was beaten up by the police. Craig was pressured and pressured and pressured. He had what amounts to a mental breakdown, and then he had a heart attack because of the pressure. After the divorce, He married Nadira, and now they live in UK with their son, and he's a very enthusiastic promoter of human rights around the world. He wrote Murder in Samarkand, and I heard a couple of weeks ago that he's now sold the film rights on his book, Murder in Samarkand, which details all that I have said, plus an awful lot more. So I await that one with interest. I mentioned Elior Ghaniyev, the foreign minister. Here he is. On my last night in Uzbekistan, and the flight left to come to UK left just before midnight, I got everything packed up. I had arranged to meet some of the lads for a few beers before going up to the airport. I was due to meet them at 6 o'clock. At 4 o'clock in the afternoon, I received a message that the foreign minister wanted to see me. Well, if I had refused to go, there's no way I would have got out of the country. So I went to see him. And when you see Elior Ghaniyev, you realise he is a big lad. Yes, he is. He's a former Olympic wrestler and a colonel in the KGB. A very pleasant farewell, but the only thing was that the Uzbeks had their revenge. They gave me a present of a nice cut glass vase. My wife loves flower arranging, and that vase you would have thought would have been ideal. It's this high, it's that wide, and it is an absolute horror with its shape, and it weighs a ton. And I was all for ditching it somewhere before I flew home, but I was stuck with it because I was being watched all the way, and if I had appeared at the airport without it, there would have been all hell let loose, I can assure you. Anyway, after all that, let's go down to the seaside, on the Aral Sea. Hope you've got your buckets and spare swimming costumes. Off we go. Oh dear. One of the planet's worst environmental disasters. The Aral Sea is shrinking. It's fed by two rivers, the Sirdaria and the Amu Daria. The Amu Daria is the main source of water. That's the old river Oxus. And both rivers are handling snow melt off the Tian Shan Mountains, which are the back end, as I said earlier, of the Himalayas. Almost 10 years ago, it was down to 10% of its original size. And if you look here at the two photographs, you will see up here, there is an island. But it's no longer an island over here. On that island, the Russians had a chemical plant. Easy to defend, because anybody coming over there had to come over by boat, so they would have been easily spotted, and there was no problem. Once the sea began to shrink, because of the water flow down the rivers was seriously curtailed, then you could walk across to this island. When the Russians left, they left an awful lot of stuff there, and where on earth it has gone now, I simply don't know. So we have a threat. Anyway, I decided to go out to the Aral Sea to have a look. I did 2 trips. The first one was on my own with a couple of locals, and the second time it was together with various people who'd heard about the first trip and wanted to come. So I had the stand-in for Craig Murray, who wanted to come. I had the Italian ambassador and several other gentlemen. As I said, the Aral Sea is fed primarily by the Amu Daria, which rises beyond Tajikistan down in the bottom right-hand corner, forms the border between Afghanistan and Uzbekistan, and then the border between Turkmenistan and Uzbekistan. Lots and lots of snowmelt. It's an enormous river. And that is the only bridge across it between Uzbekistan and Afghanistan. I took that photograph on the northern shore, on the southern shore in Afghanistan, as you're not allowed to photograph the bridge from the Uzbek side. It was across that bridge that the Russians trailed back with their bloody noses. And this is the reason why the Aral Sea is shrinking. There are lots and lots of pumping stations taking the water out of the river and putting it on the cotton fields. Cotton is a very profitable crop, estimated at $1 billion a year in exports for Uzbekistan, possibly more. Uzbekistan has a major problem that it is one of the only 2 double landlocked countries in the world. By double landlocked, I mean you have to cross 2 other countries to reach open seas. So you can see that export is a major problem. I referred earlier to Pointless, and the other double landlocked country is Liechtenstein. Oh, and by the way, child labour is still used. Schools are closed, children forced into the fields for a month at a time, universities closed, villages packed off to the cotton fields in tremendous heat. We are in Tashkent, up here. We're going to drop down to Samarkand on our way over to the Aral Sea. And we've got a long journey. It's a good 3-day trip across the deserts. In between Bukhara and Nukus there, you have the Kizilkum Desert. We'll come on to that one. And of course, along the Golden Road to Samarkand. How romantic. Thank you, James Elroy Flecker. I bet you never drove down it, mate. You sat at home in your study, didn't you? Yes. Because that's what the road's like. Barren. Apart from in the spring, when the rains have been. Tulips everywhere. It's allegedly the home of the original tulip, Tulip Kaufmannii. Lots of locals trudging along. Yeah, mother trudging behind granny, sitting on her donkey with the child. A shepherd sitting there looking at his goats and sheep. And we reach Samarkand, and many people will have seen this photograph of the Reggistan. The madrasa here was completed in 1066. That's an easy date for me to remember. Don't ask me the exact dates of the other 2, but I think the one in the middle is 14th century and the one on the right is the 15th century. Incredible size to look at, incredible mosaics on the front of them. Another bit of old Samarkand, Shahizam Zimba. This is where all the emirs have been buried. I took Chris Patton there for half a day before he flew back over to Brussels. He'd never been in that part of the world and he wanted to see Samarkand. And this photograph isn't the important one. The next one is. Look down in the arch. That was a surreptitiously taken photograph. That's the KGB sitting with us and watching us and finding out who we talk to. We move on another 5-hour journey across the desert to Bukhara, where those 2 unfortunates spent a couple of years in a right hole. And the Kolyan Minaret, the highest building in Central Asia at one stage. It acted as a lighthouse for all the camel trains. You can see it miles and miles away. It was built in 1127, and when it was completed, The emir called in the architect and said to him, "That is fantastic, I like it. You're not going to build one for anybody else?" "Oh, of course not." "No, you're not." He took him up to the top of the Kolyam minaret and threw him off. These are part of the old warehouses from the old Silk Road. Still there. Lots and lots of ancient madrasas, mosques, marketplaces. They all stay exactly as they have for centuries. Fascinating place with not very many visitors. Not many tourists buying carpets. The women have plenty of time to sit there drinking tea. The old men sitting by an irrigation pond. And this young lady. Everybody's in national dress. It's just the foreigners like me who don't wear it. And if you were to look very closely at the corner of her mouth, she is really an up-to-date young lady. She's chewing gum. Would we bother to have a galvanised bucket repaired? We'd be down to B&Q or wherever to buy another one for a few pounds, wouldn't we? A plastic one. But here, the well buckets are all repaired on a regular basis. And finally, another 4 or 5 hours journey, and we reach Khiva, a UNESCO heritage site. I prefer Bukhara. Bukhara's got life and people in it. Khiva is a bit of a mausoleum. Again, great minarets. This blue one, surprisingly, not finished. The reason being, the emir ran out of money. Huge, that would have been the largest one anywhere in the world. And still you see camels coming into the city. I just got the tail end of about 6 camels going round the corner. And this is the Friday Mosque. 212 columns, all wooden. From the 10th, 12th century. And yes, there is a slight tourist industry there, so they try and sell you the hats. You look at her and you think, yes, well, she wouldn't make a bad wife. But could you afford her? Just look at the amount of mascara she puts on her eyebrows. But there again, you'd be marrying a rich woman, just look how much gold she's got in her teeth. And on we go up to the Aral Sea now, out of Khiva, along the desert. You see the distance he's having to take his goats and sheep out to the Amu Darya River, the Oxus River, way in the distance, which is shrinking because all the water that they pumped out of the river further upstream, the same in Turkmenistan, they put it on the fields and it never gets back into the river. It goes into new swampland. Very little of it gets put back into the river. It's lost. And here we are crossing the Kizilkum on a road that takes 5 hours dead straight. Well, I tell a lie. It's not dead straight. About halfway along, it suddenly veers 90 left, and then 90 right, half a kilometre later. I am convinced that as this is a Russian military road, and one on which they used to land aircraft, if necessary, they started at opposite ends and aimed at each other and got it slightly wrong. It was either that or it was done deliberately to keep the drivers away. This area is Karakal, Pakistan. You can do absolutely nothing with it. It's a disaster zone. So the Uzbeks had a lot of sense. They said, we'll make you an autonomous republic. Look after yourselves. But if you pass any legislation, we're going to have the veto on it. the hottest desert in the world, but for only 1 month of the year. That month is known by the Uzbeks as chiller. Well, chiller it ain't. Not that hot. It is bone dry, very, very dry, very hot. And as you walk around, you generate static, and if you put your hand on a metal doorknob, you get an almighty shock. You learn not to put your hand on, but to put the back of your hand on to let the electricity leap across the gap before you put your hand properly on the handle. And finally we reach the Aral Sea, or where the Aral Sea used to be, with its own version of the White Cliffs of Dover. You can see how much the sea has retreated here, and this is the western side, that very narrow sliver of water that remains. And there used to be a fishing industry there, freshwater fish. There's a cannery there, that's defunct. These fishing boats are now 10 to 12 miles from the nearest open water. The economy of the area has been destroyed. Very sad sights. And if you want to go down to the sea for a paddle, then you have to walk across a very long beach. And of course there's no tides there. Everything is muddy. You can't take a vehicle across this sand because it will get bogged down in no time. And when you reach the sea, it's got this lovely white sand, just like a coral beach on a tropical island. But it ain't sand. Those are chemicals, agricultural chemicals. The Russians used to use Agent Orange on the cotton fields, the same stuff they used in Vietnam to remove the foliage from the jungle so they could see the Viet Cong. This was put onto the cotton crop so it made it easier to pick the cotton with no leaves there. What water did come back into the rivers flowed into the Aral Sea. As a result, there is gross pollution, horrendous problems, child mortality and maternal death, and one of the highest incidences of throat cancer in the world around there. When the wind gets up, that dust, which is just as if you'd thrown cement in the air, gets everywhere. It gets as far south as Pakistan. And I mentioned Craig Murray's replacement. Here he is. He didn't believe you couldn't paddle in the Aral Sea, so he went in and started to sink in the mud. The Italian ambassador had a much better idea. And of course, all that way out there, with these diplomats, and where'd you put them up for the night? Well, you put them up in that tent, because there's nothing else out there, mate. We had a stew cooked up on that fire by the locals who were travelling with us. And then we sat down, and the locals had been extremely thoughtful. They thought of everything. They brought a six-pack with them of 1 litre bottles of vodka. We had a very merry night. And so, next morning, we trailed back across the back end of the Kizilkum Desert, no roads, just one track coming up the cliff. That's the only track for about 10 miles, and if you get it wrong, it's an awful long way to drive up and down over barren countryside, trying to find your way up the cliff to escape. And ladies and gentlemen, this is my favourite shot of the Aral Sea. It's a little patch of the Aral Sea, the southern end, which has survived. Heaven knows how. It hasn't got as polluted as the main water, and it actually has plants growing in it. This was an October dawn with the sun just coming up, and this is my fondest memory of the Aral Sea. And at that point I will say Rahmat in Uzbek, Spasiba in Russian, and thank you to you for listening.
Are you ready to take any questions, Mr. Reddish?
Please call me Peter, and yes, I'd be delighted to. There's a question over there, gentleman at the back.
Do you think it is morally acceptable to organise tourist trips to Uzbekistan and other countries in that area? I know that various U3A groups have done that. Given the nature of the regime, is it morally acceptable?
That's a very good question, because where's the money going that you pay for those trips? The travel companies work with hotels, which are international hotels, which in turn will be bribing the regime to keep their hotels open. Who's providing all the souvenirs? Very few of the Uzbeks. Most of the Uzbeks living in the villages have very, very little money at all. I never saw a starving Uzbek, but you don't see grossly fat Uzbeks very often either. And yes, I would, if you have any conscience at all, I think you would think very seriously about going out there. Particularly the way they deal with human rights. We're not going to see any improvement at all in human rights in that country, I would think, for the next decade. When the president was taken to be buried in Samarkand, the Russian Prime Minister attended the burial. Putin was at the G20 conference in China. He called in on his way back, laid a wreath at the president's grave, and immediately went into the Summer Palace in Samarkand to meet the mafia, and gave his seal of approval for the Prime Minister to act on a temporary basis until the elections take place. According to the legislation in Uzbekistan, the chairman of the Senate should have been running the country in the absence of a president, but they palmed it off to the Prime Minister. And I would think that he will get at least 80%, if not 90% of the vote in 2 months' time. It's a foregone conclusion. You pays your money, you takes your choice.
Hello, Peter.
Yes.
I read a fascinating book by the former British ambassador to Russia, and apparently prior to the Russian invasion of Afghanistan, when the Afghanistan government was being played by insurgents, they asked for the Russians for help. The Russian generals said, don't touch it with a barge pole, having looked at the history of the British of the Northwest Frontier. But they were asked initially for a company, squadron of helicopters, and then it just snowballed. Very interesting. It's thought that some of the Russian soldiers fought there at that time, who were captured, and in return for their lives, they were turned by the Taliban, and are now still there fighting for the Taliban.
It wouldn't surprise me. But in Uzbekistan, the Russian population has dropped drastically. It's down to about 15% of the level it was before perestroika and Uzbek independence. And the Uzbeks immediately decided to disenfranchise the Russians, not by law, but by changing from the Cyrillic alphabet to the Latin alphabet. Russians couldn't read anything, and also using Uzbek as the language, not Russian.
Well, Peter, That was fascinating for me. I'm not geographically totally illiterate, but I must admit that central part of the globe was a mystery to me, and I thought it was some kind of medieval desert, whereas we had up-to-date, if a run-down town, and something very westernised and so on. And also fascinating because I thought with modern media, 24 hours a day, we knew everything that went on in the world now, but there's still a huge area there about which we know very, very little. Very sadly to hear that the skullduggery is equal on both sides, the west and the east as well. But thank you very, very much, Peter, for a wonderful talk. Thank you.
Thank you. It was a pleasure.